Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me today for our Deep Roots Native Plant webinar. Before we begin on an awesome presentation about how to plan your garden for winter interest and expressing the beauty of our native habitat gardens, I just have a couple of notes for y'all about some fun upcoming events. Before I get started on those notes, though, let us know where you're tuning in from here in the chat. I'm sitting here in chilly Kansas City, enjoying the sun that's coming out, but it is pretty cold. I guess it is finally winter here. Okay. Oops. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Missouri Department of Conservation, for protecting fish, forest, and wildlife and connecting us to nature in our backyards and beyond. I also like to thank viewers like you for making programs like this possible. If you have New Year's resolutions to learn more about native plants and how to support our landscapes, join us February 11th and 12th for our annual Planet Native Landscapes Conference. It'll be held at the Kauffman Foundation and Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center right here in Kansas City. 2 full days to learn from our guest experts who are traveling from all over to tell us the best practices for supporting nature at home. Visit us online at planetnative.org to learn more information. Also in the new year, I will be hosting our Discover Native Gardening sessions at the Discovery Center, where you'll learn seasonal skills, enjoy camaraderie, and feel empowered. This January and February, we'll be focusing on growing native plants in the greenhouse there. So if you've always wanted to learn how to grow native plants from seed in an indoor setting, or even learn tips about winter sowing, this is a great opportunity to learn hands-on. Following today's program, I will be sure to include links to all these upcoming events so you can get registered. This webinar will be recorded and all resources will be available online. As I mentioned, I'll be emailing you following today's presentation with a link to today's show as well as resources covered. Don't forget, drop your comments in the chat. And if you have questions about different species for your garden, how to plan for winter interest, supporting wildlife, all of that, I'll be here live after my presentation today to go over any of your questions. So I especially love winter time for the planning reasons because you get to dream big and then be ready for when spring comes. And after today's program, I hope you'll visit us online at deeproots.org for more information on upcoming events, webinars, native gardening resources, and more. Consider making a donation while you're there. Okay, so before we jump into today's program, this is a presentation I actually gave at the Discovery Center last weekend. And it's one of my favorite presentations to give because oftentimes when we're working on our gardens, we're not often thinking ahead of what they'll look like and how they can support nature in wintertime. So I hope you'll join me in shifting your perspectives on what you might find beautiful and consider adding more native plants to your landscape this coming growing season. Okay, we're going to go ahead and jump in, and I hope you enjoy today's presentation on winter gardens at the Discovery Center. Thank you so much. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with our presentation because I got a lot of ground to cover. So first, I want to welcome you all to the virtual classroom today. We will be discussing winter beauty, planning your garden for winter interest. I'll be your host, Cydney Ross. I'm the outdoor education manager with Deep Roots. So in my job, I get to share cool presentations on native plants to help y'all on your gardening journeys. I'm also a naturalist, so many of you may have joined me for hikes, whether here at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center in Kansas City or elsewhere across Kansas and Missouri. So first I'd like to open up and talk about kind of our general perspective on what we find beautiful in the landscape. I'm very pleased that native plants are becoming kind of a trend in our society as we realize the ecological benefits of adding native gardens to our landscape and limiting the amount of turf grass we have. So the one thing about native plants that I am working on is helping us shift our perspective on what we find beautiful, right? Because the American turf lawn has been so deeply seated in our society that sometimes it's hard to see that there's other beautiful options out there beyond turf grass. So I like to share these images of native plants. We've got lots of different textures and colors, shapes, and not only is it beautiful, but it's also helping our songbirds, it's helping our insects, because when you think about a turf grass lawn, it's akin to a food desert. And who doesn't love birds? So bird watching in winter is one of my favorite winter sports. It's a really tough time for our wildlife, and it's great to support birds by having bird feeders and things like that. But when you start to add native plants, you are providing them not just shelter, but food so that they can endure these tough winter months. So here on the left, you can see some snow-capped coneflowers, Echinacea purpurea in this case. And on the right, we have a catbird sitting in a beautyberry bush. So both the seed heads and berries offer food, the correct type of food that our wildlife has evolved with for millennia. So it's got good protein, fats, things like that to help our wildlife get through the winter. Something else you may notice on your standing plant material are something called galls. Now, galls are these weird lumps and bumps that are seen on leaves, stems, and other parts of plants. But what is happening here is not quite a symbiotic relationship between a plant and insect, but a relationship nonetheless where insects lay their eggs and a hormone is released when they do that that tells the plant to grow. So this often doesn't hurt the plant, though it looks weird, but inside is a baby insect or many baby insects. So we've got larvae like the goldenrod gall fly that you may see in spherical forms among goldenrod, especially Canada goldenrod. Now, why is this important? And the reason being is, again, for our wildlife to get through winter. So yes, it's great that they have bird seed in our backyard, but when birds like our black-capped chickadees and our downy woodpeckers peck into these galls, they're getting high protein snacks that they can't often find elsewhere in our landscape. So just another great reason to leave your plant materials standing in winter. Again, not just for the beauty, but for the benefits of supporting our wildlife. So I like to start off that presentation kind of talking about that because even though things appear to be dormant in winter, the landscape is still full of life. So whether it is insects that are overwintering in our plant material, which then provide food for larger animals, or habitat considerations like these brush piles, there's lots of ways you can support wildlife at home. And I want to also show that that if you have a space in your landscape where you want to support wildlife, but maybe you've got neighbors who aren't particularly enthused about having standing plant vegetation, you could always cut them back and create artful brush piles, right? So this still provides habitat, it still provides overwintering insect shelter. Here at the Discovery Center, we'll do this for certain areas, though we'd like to leave most of our habitat intact for our wildlife, but this does make for a fun and intentional approach to leaving that standing plant material. So top left corner, you can see we piled up some stems along I believe that's a button bush, top and bottom images on the left. On the right, you can see a freestanding form. So this is a great activity you can do with your family. We see lots of animals using these shelters, from birds to rabbits to even children. So it's a lot of fun and just another method for you to support wildlife in your backyard. And before we dive into a whole slew of species, which we'll be covering the majority of this presentation, I just want to encourage you all to go outside this winter, bundle up, get cozy, and get outdoors, because some of the best inspiration you can find is right here in our own backyards. So whether you're walking trails like at Parkville Nature Sanctuary, the Discovery Center, or maybe visiting a friend who has a native garden. It's a great way to get inspired for the seasons ahead so that you can start planning your garden, not just for spring and summer and fall interest, but winter interest as well, which is often overlooked in my opinion. Okay, so I want to share with you all some images of my own home garden that I started planting this year and show you the progress as well as images of what the plants looked like from the initial planting like you see here to being a little more established in the growing season to what they look like right now. So I live here in Kansas City and I'm renting a house from a family member. And so the first thing I wanted to do before I even got moved in was add native plants to my front yard and get rid of a lot of turf grass. So you can see here on the right that I have done the method of quite literally digging out squares of turf. So there's lots of methods you can use to convert turf to garden. This is definitely a more labor intensive approach, but I wanted to try it because I've done things like lasagna composting, solarizing, and I wanted to see, well, what is it like to actually remove turf grass with a shovel? And I decided to also do that on this space because it had quite a bit of soil buildup already, and it was a small enough footprint. I thought, well, what the heck, I'll give it a shot. And so I did this over the course of a few months, starting in May, and finished up planting actually just a couple months ago. And didn't I've got more planting to do, but that was for my first phase this year. So this is what my front yard looks like right now. Quite the transformation from the image you had just seen. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the different species that I've incorporated into my garden. Again, what they look like during the growing season, as well as what they look like right now. Because again, I think wintertime is such an undervalued but beautiful time to enjoy nature, especially in your own gardens. So here you can see just some of the species that I've utilized. Um, I tend to be um, a little dynamic in my gardening approach because I love diversity, right? But the thing about having lots of diversity is it can look a little cluttered. So I did try to limit my palette, which is easier said than done, but here are the species that I have settled on. So threadleaf blue star, rose verbena, a matrix of copper shouldered sedge, cliff goldenrod, foxglove beard tongue, and blanket flower. And then of course I have a service berry to kind of anchor everything together. So though my landscape is not finished yet, this is kind of the general theme that I've got going on in my front yard. So let's jump right in. One of my favorite plants, which is a great ground cover species, is rose verbena, typically found in glades, which are dry, rocky, shallow soiled areas. This plant doesn't get any taller than about 6 inches. It's a crawler, it's a spreader, and it has very fragrant pink blooms in the springtime. Starts as early as late March, early April, and I still have some blooms that we're hanging on before we got some hard freezes. So on the left, you can see it in bloom. On the right, that is the foliage right now. So semi-evergreen leaves with a splash of purple, nice scalloped edges. Again, ground cover species are really important for your garden because they hold the soil, prevent erosion, and deter weeds, right? So if you have an open area that's just mulch, you will have to incorporate into your maintenance plan that you're probably going to be weeding that unless you put a plant there that can hold that space. So rose verbena is a really great one. You can see here on the bottom left how it spills over my terrace as well. I'm hoping that this plant will be spreading seed down to that lower house strip edge against my sidewalk, which I'm sure it will. But right now, this is what it looks like. And so, got to give a shout out to Rose Verbena for that. It fills, it spills, and it thrills. So, one of my favorite ground cover species. It is full sun. It could probably handle a little bit of shade, but not much. It is more of a full sun species. Now here we have copper shoulder sedge and threadleaf blue star. And before I get too much further, We will have time at the end for Q&A. Just make sure if you could put your questions in the Q&A section rather than the chat so I can see them and answer them at the end. And then yeah, so that would be awesome because I love talking about plants and I want to hear all your all's questions and talk about how we can get our gardens ready for next year. So here, like I mentioned, sedges and threadleaf blue star. So if you've heard me talk before, I often mention the value of incorporating a sedge or grass into your landscape, not just for wildlife support, but for visual cohesion. Coppers or sedges in general, they are in the carex family. They are related to grasses, but they are typically shorter, smaller, and often shade species. Now, copper shoulder sedge is actually a full sun species, which I'll get into a little bit more here, but I wanted to show kind of this fine texture because it's a great way to transition from lawn to garden, quite literally if you're removing your lawn and turning it into a garden, or if you have a garden up against your lawn, right? So that fine texture visually helps transition those two spaces. So in my garden, I did a matrix of copper shoulder sedge because I wanted to have lots of fine texture spread throughout my landscape and as a way to, again, transition from that lawn to garden. Now, another fine texture plant is our threadleaf blue star. And this image here is a friend of mine's home, and that golden color plant here above that retaining wall, that is all threadleaf blue star. Look how beautiful that looks in fall. Nice golden foliage, fine texture. And in the springtime, it has these stunning light blue flowers. So if you have been to the Discovery Center during our native plant sales in the springtime, you may see this plant towards the center's entrance, and it is just beautiful. It's a very charismatic plant, great formal qualities. It is also another full sun species, but one of my favorite plants, especially for more of a formal landscape. Also kind of has like cottage vibes to it, but I really enjoy this plant and its delicate nature. And again, those I like to have combinations of fine and bold textures in my landscape to kind of balance things out. The copper-shouldered sedge that I mentioned, Carex bicknellii. This is a new to me species that I found at Crit Site here in Belton. I bought a whole flat of them and again, created kind of a matrix. So I was like, okay, I'm going to plant this across my entire front yard and then plant forbs, also known as flowering herbaceous plants in between all of that. And by using one or more species of grass or sedge, again, it creates kind of a formal, intentional look to the landscape rather than plopping things randomly across. It ties everything together. So that's something I do recommend generally for native landscape design is thinking about those plants that you can see consistently through the landscape, again, to create that intentionality for viewers. So the other thing I like about this plant, I think I mentioned, is it's a full sun species, right? A lot of our sedges are woodland species, which is great. But this one is a full sun species that doesn't get very tall. So it was my first time planting it, and we can kind of go back and see here next to the rose verbena, these clumps of grass looking plants, that is actually the copper shouldered sedge. So it has some nice formal qualities to it. And again, I really like those fine textures paired with bolder leaves and broader leaves. Okay, so one of the next species I want to discuss is blanket flower, Glandularia pulchella. And this is also my first time utilizing this plant in a landscape, and it's an annual species. So a lot of the native plants that I work with and that you may find at your local native plant nurseries and sales are perennials. A perennial being a plant that comes back year after year. Now, annuals, on the other hand, think about our dandelions, some of our cool season plants like henbit. They their whole goal is to flower, get pollinated, and produce seed because that original plant's going to die and the seeds are going to become the next generation of that plant. So I wanted something that had As close to immediate gratification as possible, because since our perennials take time to get established, they don't often bloom in the first year. Well, blanket flower does because it's an annual, because the whole goal is for this plant to proliferate so the seeds can then grow into new plants in the new year. And this plant does not disappoint. So you may, I've seen this plant planted in Kansas off of Mission, or in Mission, Kansas off of Johnson Drive on some new garden beds. And I think it's just fabulous. So it gives you that what every gardener desires, which is instant gratification in the garden. It gives some cheery blooms. And then not to mention these fun seed heads that stick around during winter, which provides food for birds, which can also help reestablish your seed bank. So in a lot of new garden settings, right, what you're dealing with are lots of different plants coming up because you've disturbed the soil or disturbed the seed bank. Well, by leaving your plants intact during the winter time, you give those plants a chance to reestablish themselves in the seed bank. So you have plants coming up that you actually want in your garden. So very fun. I can't wait to see how this plant spreads and bounces back next year. So you'll have to stay tuned for that. Another awesome species that I appreciate very much in winter as well as the growing season is our foxglove beard tongue. This is Penstemon digitalis. On the right, you can see the really elegant seed heads, which are full of seed, and they stay nice and upright in the winter time. They've got a beautiful rust color to them. On the left, you can see the semi-evergreen basal foliage. So what I love about this plant is those leaves kind of stay green, a little bit maroon during winter. You can see they do start to brown a bit, but they are keeping some interest low to the ground during winter time. And when they're in their growing season, I mean, just look how stunning these plants are. White tubular flowers providing nectar for long-tongued insects like our bumblebees, and hummingbirds, moths, butterflies, all types of insects benefit from this plant. And as you see in the image on the left, if you like bumblebee butts, this is a plant for you. I mentioned that kind of cottagecore style earlier. This is definitely on that list for me as well. Very charismatic plant, blooms in around, I want to say May, maybe May. Every season, I feel like I'm re-meeting all my native plant friends. So, yeah, just thinking about that. Probably, I would say late spring, just shy of early summers when this plant blooms. It is typically a full sun species, though I have heard from friends that it does work well on woodland edges and can handle a touch of shade. So, something in my gardens, I do like to push the boundaries on that a little bit and just kind of see what other conditions can these plants handle in the landscape. Okay, so wild bergamot or bee balm, or as I like to call this plant, short bee balm. This is Monarda bradburyana. Notice the striking seed heads, these nice globular shaped seed heads, paired with these beautiful purple foliage. So this is a culinary plant, so you can use this as an herb. Kind of has an oregano flavor to it. Sometimes they taste more like lavender. I absolutely adore this plant. And unlike its cousin, Monarda fistulosa, which we'll see here in a minute, this stays short. So this is a photo I took from my garden just the other day. The leaves, I mean, they're really vibrant, very much a show-stopping piece. So I like to have lots of swaths of this shorter bee balm along sidewalk edges, right up next to my ground cover species. It's a nice kind of seasonal interest in between your structural and ground cover plants. And the blooms in spring are also gorgeous. Again, because of the tubular shape of the flower and the spurs seen on these flowers, they are attractive to long-tongued insects who can reach those nectar rewards and in turn pollinate this plant. So not only are the leaves edible, but the flowers are too. And I mentioned the taller bee balm, Monarda fistulosa, which I think is better suited for more informal areas because of how prolific this plant can be. Something important to think about in your own garden is the sociability of plants, or as one of my friends mentioned, the weight class, right? So if you're thinking of like a boxer, are they a heavyweight or a lightweight? Well, for Monarda fistulosa, definitely a heavyweight. So be sure you are pairing plants with similar growing habits, right? So thinking of really prolific species, pair those together. Whereas you have more demure species like the Monarda bradburyana, or pussy toes, or other more demure species, you want to pair those together. So thinking about plants in that way can be really helpful and take the guesswork out of things, because there's nothing more frustrating than having to weed out a plant that's super prolific in the garden, um, than um, than just going ahead and knowing your plants and making the right plans to get them in the ground. So I like to think about it like that. Don't be afraid to plant something like Monarda fistulosa. Just know you're picking the right plant for the right place and for the other plants around them. And just like the Monarda bradburyana, Monarda fistulosa also has those beautiful tubular flowers and is a great culinary plant. Oh, also, just as a sidebar, something I learned recently, American goldfinches, which are these beautiful bright yellow birds, or the males are bright yellow anyway, they're one of our few songbirds that feed their babies seeds. So most of our songbirds rely on caterpillars and larval insects to raise their young. But American goldfinches can feed their babies seeds, and they pick especially small seeds like Monardas and Echinaceas. So I just thought that was really cool and thought I'd share that with you. So wintertime, you'll definitely see songbirds eating the seeds off of these plants if you leave your vegetation standing. Okay, so prairie pussy toes. This is a very, very short, the shortest ground cover species that we have here in Missouri. Look how stunning these leaves are. So really fuzzy, narrow leaves. There's several pussy toe or Antenaria species, including Parlinii, which is our broad-leaved pussy toe. But this one you can find in high quality prairies, and along edges of woodlands even. So, though this plant technically has an allelopathic chemical which prohibits the growth of other plants, it's not that strong against other species. So, like I was talking about pairing appropriate plants with similar sociabilities, I would definitely recommend not pairing this plant with other more robust species that spread, because it can easily get outcompeted despite having that chemical defense mechanism. But here's what it looks like in bloom. And as the common name indicates, the flowers look like little kitten toes. And I don't know if you see it here on the left, but there is a native bee pollinating that the flowers there. And so I took these photos, and I really love this plant, especially along walkways between stepping stones. I mean, look how cute that is. And something else to note is our Antenaria species are host plants for the American painted lady butterfly. So very cool, very cute, and supportive of our wildlife. Now, don't be alarmed if you plant this plant and then you notice it is being completely demolished by insects. Our plants have evolved with our wildlife for millennia. They know what's going on. And as long as your plant wasn't just planted like a few weeks prior, it should be fine and bounce back. So that is something I like to say is, if your garden is not being eaten, there's something wrong. Another great ground cover species, which anytime I've done a garden planting or design, I incorporate roundleaf groundsel, Pacra obovata. There are a couple Pacra species that you can find here in Missouri, including aurea, but obovata is better suited for full sun, drier conditions, whereas aurea is shadier, moister conditions. So whether you have either of those conditions, there's a groundsel for that. So on the left, you can see the cherry blooms. They bloom in springtime. You can see the violets behind them blooming. They also bloom at the same time as wild sweet William, Phlox divaricata, which is also a great native plant. And then on the right, you can see the beautiful purple and green foliage. So that photo on the right was taken during winter, and you can see they stay semi-evergreen. Again, ground covers are great because they hold the soil, retain moisture, prevent erosion, and you work kind of as a green mulch to spread in and around the plants. So a big winner in my book. And this is a photo I took just the other day in my own garden. This is just one plant. And what's nice about this species, same with the pussy toes. So once you plant them, as long as there's not pressure from a more prolific plant nearby, they will spread and cover the whole space. And what that means is then you have your own little nursery of that plant, and you can dig them up, divide them, spread them throughout your landscape. Something to note too is this plant is not overly prolific where it will outcompete others. So you don't have to worry about that. Because when people think, oh, this plant spreads, they often get concerned. This isn't one of those species you have to worry about. Another plant I like to pair with my golden groundsel is columbine. So columbine blooming in May, you can see here on the left, those bright red and yellow flowers are very attractive to hummingbirds, which are migrating through at that time. And you can see these, these are called spurs up here, those little tips on the plant. That's where the nectar is stored. So again, like our penstemons, which are the foxgloves, any kind of tubular flower you see, that will tell you who is going to be pollinating it, right? So tubular flowers are attractive to long-tongued insects and animals. So think of your bumblebees, of your hummingbirds, moths, butterflies, things like that. And then here on the right, this is the basal foliage of columbine, which I took a couple years ago in February. So it stays semi-evergreen. The scallop shaped and kind of the rosette forms are really cute. And you can see there are leaves all around it. So especially with our woodland species, I highly recommend you leave the leaves because these plants have adapted to have leaf cover to protect them during winter. Also, look how cute they are with when they're paired with that Pacra obovata, that golden groundsel. This is a planting I did at my mom's house, and I really love this combo, and I can't wait to see how it looks this coming spring. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into more species. These are not featured in my garden, but they are awesome for winter interest and wildlife support. So if you come to the Discovery Center today to join me for my 1 o'clock walk, which I hope you will, we will look at witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana. Now, there's two types of witch hazel found in Missouri, the common witch hazel and the Ozark witch hazel. So again, this one, Hamamelis virginiana, blooms from November to January, and Hamamella vernalis meaning spring, blooms in March. So right now across the Discovery Center, this is our plant that's in bloom. And you may be wondering, who's pollinating a plant in winter? Well, let me tell you, moths and flies. So if you caught my last, or not the last, two episodes ago of our webinar, I did a walk at the Discovery Center and I showed live footage of flies emerging and pollinating this plant. So with our winter blooming species, they rely on pollinators who emerge quickly. So think of our flies when we get warm days like today in Kansas City, it's going to be like 55 degrees, warm enough to heat the soil. So short life cycled insects like our flies and moths can emerge. They warm themselves up, whether by sunlight or vibrating their bodies, and they will find these flowers, get nectar, and in turn pollinate this plant. So I think that is just very cool. And just something to note that flies are important pollinators too, just like our moths, just like our bees. So just something to consider if you're thinking, ew, Sid, I don't like insects. Well, let me tell you, they're all very important in our ecosystem. Another awesome native shrub is our button bush. I think this is just a really stunning tree, both in bloom and in winter. They have these great dark spheres, which are the seed heads. Birds will eat the seeds over winter. They also rest in the trees and use it as habitat. I also like to call this the Dr. Seuss tree because of the big puffball flowers in spring and early summer. Very attractive to pollinators. So anytime you see this plant in bloom, you'll know if you walk up, you could probably hear it before you even get close, but there are tons of pollinators. It's also attractive to hummingbirds. and the flowers smell really nice. So buttonbush is naturally found in wet, swampy areas. So if you go to the Boot Heel, Missouri, highly recommend you visit Mingo State Park. You will see these in their natural habitat. So they can handle um, wet areas, but here at the Discovery Center, we don't have swamps, but we do have average soil, and they do quite well here as well. So something to consider, this is a very versatile shrub, doesn't get any taller than about 20 feet. We have it in full sun, but I've seen it handling medium shade down in the swamps in Mingo. So very versatile for space, large enough to create kind of a hedge-like appearance too. In my own backyard, I'm actually replacing invasive bush honeysuckle with this plant. Because the area that I have the honeysuckle in, it perfectly blocks the neighbors behind me. So I'm going to plant this and get it established and then remove the honeysuckle after the fact. It's kind of a complicated situation where it's growing in the fence. So I'm like, well, rather than removing the honeysuckle and planting, I'm kind of doing the opposite. But, we all have our own spaces and got to do what we got to do. Okay, so shady areas, our smooth hydrangea is our winner. So this is that charismatic hydrangea plant. It is our native hydrangea, smooth hydrangea, wild hydrangea, hydrangea arborescens. So it has dainty flowers, which I think are stunning as dry arrangements this time of year, both outside and if you cut them and bring them indoors. But the cool thing about this plant is if you look here on the left, those tiny little cream colored spots, those are actually the flowers. That's where the pollen and nectars are. And if you see those larger flower looking deals there on the left, those are technically leaves or modified bracts. So they serve as a function of like a billboard, like, hey, come get some pollen and nectar. And it encourages pollinators like bees to visit the plant. Now, think to our cultivated hydrangeas like Snowball, Annabelle, those are all derived from native hydrangeas, and they are altered so that they actually have more modified bracts, actual flowers. So you got to be wondering, well, where's all the pollen and nectar? Great question. So if your goal is to support wildlife in your yard, I would consider the smooth hydrangea over our cultivated hydrangea species. And another very cool thing about this plant, and another great reason to leave your plant material standing in winter, is native solitary bees will lay their eggs and nest in the stems because they are pithy on the inside, which means spongy. So it's very easy for insects to burrow in, lay eggs, or overwinter in them themselves. So very cool plant that provides beauty and benefits throughout the entire growing season and winter months. Another favorite of mine that you may be familiar with if you walk through woodlands is coralberry or buckbrush, not to be confused with the invasive buckthorn, which is an invasive species, but this is a native shrub. It's short, it does have a nice arching shape. In our natural areas, it is indicative of cattle grazing. So when you see it out in nature, it's not indicating a high quality area, but it does support wildlife and it's beautiful. So they keep their berries on throughout the winter. There are theories that birds wait until the sugars are concentrated and more fermented to eat them. I'm guessing they're not very tasty to wildlife, but they do still enjoy them when the going gets tough. And they are a host plant. So it's not always just about those blooms or berries. A lot of our native plants support our insects, right? Insects are important. They provide food for our baby songbirds and larger animals in our food chain. But here on the right, you can see a snowberry clearwing moth, which hosts on the leaves of this plant. So again, not all about the blooms. The leaves are just as important for supporting wildlife. And if you know me, I'm a total nerd, but especially a moth nerd. And I was so excited to capture this photo of a snowberry clearwing that had just emerged from its chrysalis or cocoon. I'm not actually sure which, but very cool to see that. And when I took this photo, this was a couple of years ago, I had noticed the foliage on these shrubs, which do spread rhizomatically. They do create thickets, so just be aware of that before you start incorporating this into your space. Um, I noticed the leaves had been completely defoliated, and I was like, "What is going on? Who's eating this?" Turns out it was these little cuties here, which these moths are also very important pollinators, so something to think about there. Um, and again, just to note, because they spread rhizomatically and thicket forming, just make sure you're putting them in an appropriate place where they can spread. Side of a house would be great, woodland edge. I think they're a very beautiful, charismatic plant. They're sometimes mistaken for honeysuckle because they have similar um, leaf structure. They're opposite leaves. They kind of have oval shaped leaves and berries like honeysuckle does, but these are truly bright pink fruits that you can see clustered here along this. Another great fruit producing shrub is our American beautyberry, Calocarpa americana. Here are photos of the fruits in winter. Now, this winter, the fruits are already gone. So the birds have already done their work getting these berries here at the Discovery Center. But you can see just how sometimes some seasons they will stick around longer and provide food for birds throughout the harsh months of winter. And just how cute is that with the snow topped on them? I've love nothing more than walking around a garden or nature center when we get fresh snow and just see how it interacts with our plants. So during the growing season, they are a very attractive plant, preferring sun, but they can handle some shade too. And I would say average soil is a preferred type for this plant. These berries are fuchsia, bright fuchsia colored and with chartreuse leaves. So very attractive. They do get large, so 3 to 5 feet is typical for this plant here. And let's see here. Second, there we go. The next species I want to show you is rigid goldenrod. Now, I have lots of thoughts on this particular plant, but just in general, I want to talk about solidagos or goldenrods because they are so important for our wildlife. They're considered keystone species or our most valuable players in our ecosystem because they provide support for a ton of other animals. And so that's something to think about in your garden. Are you providing support throughout the whole year? A lot of times I see people getting excited about spring. They want spring bloomers, but then they forget to plan for summer, late summer, and fall blooming species. So goldenrods can be great for that, but they can be prolific. So what do? Rigid goldenrod is one of those prolific species that I don't recommend for a small garden. Ask me how I know that. I planted some in Primrose Prairie, my first public garden here at the Discovery Center, and it is one I'm editing out and putting into larger gardens because of how prolific it is. But look how gorgeous the seed heads are in the fall. So something else to think about is how do you manage plants if you don't want them to spread? Well, let's say you have a plant like aromatic aster, which I have in my own garden at home. It's also a prolific spreader. So something you can do if you don't want it to spread is to deadhead it before these seeds become fluffy and spread on the wind. Um, Another thing, of course, planning for an appropriate space where they can spread so you don't have to deadhead them. Or embrace that you want them to spread. So I've put them on a little hillside in my front yard where they will fill out nicely. Not the rigid goldenrod, but the aromatic aster rather. But similar application applies here. Just make sure you are considering your maintenance plan because as you all know, there is no such thing as a no maintenance garden, okay? But there are plants that require different types of maintenance. Some require less maintenance. So those are things you really want to consider when you're selecting your plant species. And here's what it looks like in bloom. So we have this along the pond edge here at the Discovery Center. We had initially planted, I think, 6 or 7 goldenrod species, and now it's mostly a monoculture of this plant. Now, that will change from season to season, I'm sure, but the past couple years, it has been nothing but stiff goldenrod. So again, just a thing to think about in your landscape. Do you want a plant that's prolific, robust, that will spread? You might, and this is a great plant for that. No such thing as a bad plant, just circumstance, right? Speaking of prolific, let's talk about Amsonia illustris, our shining blue star species. Stunning fall foliage. You can't beat the yellow foliage, the gold foliage of this plant, but boy, is she a robust friend. I like to say she's extra outgoing because not only does she spread by seed, she spreads rhizomatically. And if you've ever tried to dig up this plant, um, I hope your back's okay because it is very difficult to remove once you get it established. But again, it can be perfect for certain areas because as you can see, um, it wants to be a monoculture. It wants to be able to spread and take over a space. It's got big presence, and that can be perfect for certain situations. I used to have this house that would have had the perfect spot for this plant had I been familiar with it at the time, where I could hardly get anything else to grow, but things I didn't want growing there. This would have fit the bill and provided blooms in um, late spring, early summer, and then awesome foliage in the winter. So again, think about what kind of space you have. Can it handle prolific plants, or do you need more demure, intentional species that can work well together? But also, if you want to plant this plant and have other species, just make sure you're also planting robust plants around it. So river oats would do well with this plant. Aromatic aster would do well with this plant. So would the tall bee balm, Monarda fistulosa. They're all similar in terms of being prolific, and I think those could actually work really well together. Okay, so where are my wasp friends at? I love insects, if you didn't already know that. And I love nothing more than visiting our Pycnanthemum species in summertime to observe all the different beautiful wasp species we have here in Missouri. So here I have slender mountain mint, which is also a great culinary plant. I harvested some from my garden because I love mint tea. Um, so I mixed that with actually some of the Monarda that I had growing in my front yard, and my mouth is watering because it's so yummy. Not only is it delicious, but I think it's really beautiful. So in the fall and winter, you can see on the left the dried seed heads. They're a light gray color. They contrast with all the rusts and golds you'll see in the landscape. And amazing pollinator benefits in the summertime. I really like in this bottom image on the right how they've paired it with Rudbeckia species. So you have some nice color and shape contrast, right? That's a great example of utilizing thin, fine textures with broader textures in your landscape. All right, and now we'll talk about common milkweed. So another polarizing species. Um, I love milkweeds, and I do think this is better suited for a more formal, or rather informal area or a section along a structure like a fence or the side of a house or a garage. It's an awesome plant. And as many of you may know, it's also a host plant for monarch caterpillars. So our monarch butterflies, as a caterpillar, they can only eat milkweed species or Asclepias species, and this is one of them that they do eat. And I bring it's not their favorite that I've seen here at the Discovery Center. They do seem to prefer marsh or world, but I do sometimes see caterpillars on these plants. But I'm here to talk about their beauty in wintertime. So here on the left, you can see their upright stalks. They stay upright through the winter. They have fluffy silk that is coming out, which are attached to their seeds, which will then fly on the wind. Now, just like world milkweed, even though that's a shorter species, this species is gets up to 5 feet tall, and not only does it spread by seed, it spreads rhizomatically. So again, make sure you know what you're getting into when you plant this. I wouldn't recommend planting this in your front yard. It's beautiful. It smells amazing. It smells like clover, in my opinion, and the beautiful pink flowers. But once it gets established, it really gets going. So make sure you're putting it in an appropriate space for your garden. But also keep those stems intact in your garden throughout winter because it is really beautiful. So here you can see we have it at the Discovery Center. I believe this photo is our bioswales out front in the parking lot. And it just adds some nice contrast to all the fine textures seen throughout. It's very sculptural. Okay. Oh, and Paul mentions that Asclepias syriaca has deep rhizomes if you want to transplant. That's really good to know. So a lot of our milkweed species, let me go back to that. Oops. They have tap roots. So you got to be careful not to sever that carrot-like root because you'll probably kill your plant. So with our taproot and rhizomatic species, you want to go deep, give it a wide berth and kind of go slow if you're going to be digging it up and moving it around. Now, something else I've learned with milkweed, species, especially our butterfly milkweed, is that sometimes it's easier to grow it from seed than from a potted plant, especially butterfly milkweed, which is Asclepias tuberosa. That plant and I have a love-hate relationship because it's a demure species, it's a glade species. It doesn't want to be crowded. It's a I think it's a short-lived perennial because it doesn't stick around very long. But the reason it does better by growing it from seed, and this is the case for a lot of our plants, the seed has time to get accustomed to its environment, just like trees, right? And so if you plant like broadcast seed, which winter is an awesome time to do that, you can go ahead and broadcast seed right over bare soil this time of year, especially if we get a snowfall, broadcast it right over the snow, then the snow will draw it into the soil. The seeds will go through that cold, moist stratification period, which they often need to break dormancy in the spring in order to germinate. And they'll be good to go in just a few years. Now, it does take time for them to get established if you're broadcasting seed. But again, I do find a lot of our milkweed species do better when you just sow seed directly into your landscape rather than putting a potted plant. And I think that has to do with them being taproot species. So something to consider and another fun winter gardening activity you can do at home. All right, prairie blazing star, Liatris pycnostacia. This is one of my favorite blazing star species. They've got the nice long spikes of seed heads here that you see in the fall. So this is not a winter photo. You can see there's still leaves on the trees here in these images, but look how fiery that foliage is. I mean, my gosh, I love this plant all year round. And right now, the seed heads are still intact. Again, they stay upright, and tons of birds will cling to these stalks and eat the seeds during winter. So very beautiful. And then, of course, when they're in bloom, they are pollinator magnets. Monarch butterflies especially love our blazing star. They're blooming the same time during the migration. So this blazing star is the first of our blazing star species to bloom here in Kansas City, followed by Liatris scariosa and then Liatris aspera. So if you like the kind of visual quality or the purples or firework display of this plant, you might consider planting multiple types of Liatris in your landscape so that you get kind of a succession of these blooms, and again, greater support for wildlife as they're migrating through or if they live here. Oh yeah, and I did include another blazing star species. So that's the aspera, the dotted blazing star. Just how cute are those seed heads? I wonder how many times I've already said cute, but it's true. They're fluffy, they're spherical, they look like little ornaments almost. Very darling in the landscape. Now, Liatris aspera is typically smaller than the prairie blazing star or the Liatris pycnostacia species. And again, it blooms a little bit later. So when you're thinking about where to place these in your landscape, this one might be more towards the front, middle, rather than the back of your garden. And again, something cool about these plants I didn't mention, unlike our other species, they bloom like a firework. So you can see in this image, they start from the top and open up as they go down. How fun is that? So kind of like a sparkler. And you can see that's happening here too. The top had already bloomed and the ones below it are starting to emerge. So kind of a fun thing to observe. And I don't think I included an image of this, though I wish I had. Um, there you can find camouflage looper caterpillars on this plant too, but I'll save that for another webinar in the future. It's a really cute insect though. All right, speaking of insects, we have our rattlesnake master, Euringium yucifolium, which is actually in the carrot family. So you'll see some really cool wasps and pollinators on this plant as well in the summertime. And if you're thinking, Sid, I don't want to see wasps, like they're gonna sting me. They're not. A lot of these wasp species are so busy living their lives, doing their things, getting nectar, collecting pollen, that they don't care about you. I hate to say it, but they really don't. So every summer when these rattlesnake master blooms are blooming, I got my face this close to them, looking at all the cute insects, enjoying the blooms. This plant stays upright and is a full sun species. You'll find it on prairies. It also has really cool cultural uses. So you can gather the leaves, which are long and have little spikes on them, kind of yucca looking leaves, and you can process them to make rope. So here at the Discovery Center, we often teach classes on cordage. So if you ever see a cordage class, you will ultimately be using rattlesnake master as one of your materials, which you can then kind of roll up and braid into a strong rope material. And some of the earliest sandals ever found, and I believe, yeah, in a cave here in Missouri, or let me rephrase that. Scientists found one of the oldest pair of sandals in a cave in Missouri made of rattlesnake master. How cool is that? And they're still intact. I'm like, maybe I should spend my winter making myself a pair of rattlesnake sandals. I think that'd be pretty cool. All right, and here we have two of my favorite species. I feel like I said that about all these plants because they're so awesome. But blue false indigo, Baptisia australis here on the left, and white wild indigo on the right, Baptisia alba. Both are Baptisia species, as you can see, but they have slightly different structures. And I'll get into that here in just a moment. But the thing I really want to point out is how much they contrast with the rust colors in our landscape this time of year. Look at that. Aren't they stunning? The charcoal kind of satiny silver leaves really stand out. And I also love the shape of the broad leaves as well, and the seed heads. So here we have our blue false indigo in bloom. The color of the foliage is really lovely, as are those vibrant purpley blue blooms, which I think they happen in about May or June, depending on your location. And once the flowers have been pollinated, they then turn into these striking, dramatic seed heads, which, if you shake them, have a nice rattling sound to them. So not only are they beautiful, but the seeds, or the seed pods rather, provide a home for the Baptisia weevil, which, if you participate in Weevil Wednesday, you know that these are really cool insects that we can find here in our own yards, and they will eat the seeds of some of the Baptisia species. Now, something to note too that I think is really interesting about this plant is Baptisia australis is one of our tumbleweeds here in Missouri. So once we get to this time of year with the plants, they break off at the ground, and they technically would tumble away. But if you have other plants growing around them, like maybe some little blue stem or some forbs or flowers, they should stay put. But the reason they do that, they do the tumbling, is because the seeds require scarification for better germination rates. So it's no coincidence that they break off at the ground and then send up new growth the following year. Now, the Baptisia alba is a white or kind of cream colored variety. Note that it does have a different structural appearance, where the Baptisia australis had more of kind of a fountaining shape. These are more upright with just a little bit of foliage coming out from the sides. And when you think about where these species reside in natural areas, this makes a lot of sense. So there's a third Baptisia called Baptisia bractata, and that's typically found on windswept prairies. It's small, it sits low to the ground because those winds are constantly pushing it. This is also in a prairie setting, but they are typically found around other taller species to kind of hold it intact. But then again, because they're tumbleweeds, they're meant to break away and move around. So, kind of a cool plant. Not kind of, it is a very cool plant that's beautiful spring, summer, fall, and winter. All right. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the quintessential purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. How about those snow-topped hats? I think they're cute. And they support wildlife during the winter. We already talked about how songbirds will come and eat the seeds off of these plants. So if you like to watch songbirds, a great way to attract them to your garden, besides a bird feeder, right, which you have to clean so that they don't get sick. Go ahead and plant your own bird feeder, so to speak. Add several coneflower species. This here is Echinacea purpurea, which is a full sun species but can handle a little bit of shade. But you could also incorporate glade coneflower, which is Echinacea simulata. You could incorporate pale purple, which is pallida, or paradoxa, which is the yellow coneflower. Lots of options there. They bloom at different times in the year. This one is actually the last of the coneflowers to bloom in our area. But again, leaving your plant materials up supports our wildlife. And like our smooth hydrangea, the stems are pithy, which means they have that spongy center, and they provide habitat for overwintering solitary bees. Oh, just like these. So yeah, one of my favorite memories when I first started planting native was planting this purple coneflower. I also grew up with a mom who gardened, and she loved to have coneflowers in her garden. So that's when I first saw it. But if you want some, the closest thing to instant gratification in your yard, plant coneflower because they typically will bloom that first year and immediately are attractive to our wildlife. So like that metallic green sweat bee on the right, it's the coolest little bee that we have here. We've got a lot of cool insects here, but that's one of my favorites. The color is just striking. And again, they're not there to sting you. They're just doing their thing. And then here on the left, you see the goldfinch, which is picking seeds. That is a male goldfinch there. And like I mentioned earlier, they feed seeds to their babies, which I think is pretty cool. All right, y'all. So, okay. Y'all, I can talk, can't I? Oh boy. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in to today's webinar. I know we're over time. Thank you for sticking with me. I am going to make sure I answer all your questions when I send it out to y'all in the resources later this afternoon. But if you're able to stick around, I'm going to go over maybe just a couple questions that I thought would be really insightful to discuss. But before I do that, I want to remind you, I will be, like I said, emailing you all resources, including species list from today's presentation because it is jam-packed, right? I actually forgot how many species I covered until I started writing it down as we were going. So I'll have all of that good information for you. And in that same email, I ask that you complete our end of year, or rather end of season survey, because one of you will win this native plant gardening sign from Deep Roots. So if you've already entered from our last webinar, you're good to go. But I'd love for you all to give us your feedback because it's really valuable. We want to know what you want to learn about next year, how many plants you've added to your gardens, and why planting native is important to you. So keep an eye out for that survey, and I will draw a name in the beginning of the year and email one special winner information about that sign. So, okay. So just going to cover a couple questions here, and then I will respond to all of your questions in the resource that I send out after this. Okay, so someone wanted to ask about, or they're asking about matrix planting. So I just wanted to cover that real quick because I discuss using a sedge or a ground cover or grass to establish your garden. So when I say matrix planting, if you think about your garden on a piece of paper and you line it up in like a grid, you can then add one species with similar distance covering the entire landscape. And then that will give you a nice cohesive landing. And then from there, you can add your like swaths and clusters of herbaceous perennials. Um, so if that's confusing, I hope you'll join me in March for my DIY native landscape design presentation where I go more in depth about that. But when I say matrix, I'm just thinking like one species, one species to rule them all. No, one species to add to give that cohesive look so then you can have fun with other flowering species throughout your garden. So that was a great question. Um, and let's see here. Karen has a question about collecting seeds and growing them in the winter time. So they've collected some blazing star and other natives and want to plant by seed. Can they bury the pots in the ground and plant the seeds on top for now for them to sprout in the spring? Um, so what I would recommend, there's a few things you can do. I started doing winter sowing last weekend where I'm taking old recycled plastic containers, like maybe pots that plants have come in, or even produce baskets from the grocery store, fill it with soil, and then I add my seed. You don't need to bury it in the ground. You can just leave it out with a cover on it, but that has holes drilled into it so water can still reach it and keep it watered. Um, so also make sure you don't stick it in a place like against your house where it's not going to get snow or rained on because as I mentioned, a lot of our native species need cold, moist stratification in order to break dormancy in the spring. So, what that means is it needs to get cold, it needs to get wet. And we often don't think about droughts in wintertime, but here in Missouri, we often are in droughts in winter. So, make sure they're getting moisture throughout the winter time, and then they'll be hardened off and sprouting come spring. And then at that time, you just open the lid and continue to let them grow for a little while. So, great question, Karen. I'm going to answer one more question and then I'm going to let you all go and carry on with the rest of your day. So just note too, I have answered many of the questions in the Q&A. I was typing out some of the answers during this presentation. Okay, so I really like the question about, oh, where did it go? Oh, here we are. Um, so Anonymous says there's a wild area around their house and they don't know how to best identify what is already there. So this is a multi-part question, so I'll start with that first one. We have some really great free tools out there like iNaturalist and Seek and Picture This and there's several others. And if you have some that you like to use, feel free to put it in the chat. But these are phone identifying tools that didn't make sense. These are apps on your phone where you pull your camera out and it helps you identify the species in real time or based on photos. That is a great way to help identify what's already there because if you see what's growing there, it can tell you a lot about your site conditions, whether it's dry, moist, shaded, full sun, etc. So I would start there. You can also sign up for our Nature Advisors consultation program. We have gone dormant for the season, but we'll begin our native plant consultations in the spring. So you can get on our wait list for that at deeproots.org. And of course, I will include information about that in the resources. So by having a nature advisor out, we can help identify species that are there and help you with your journey of gardening with native plants. The second part of your question, what easy ground cover could you plant in a connecting open partial sun bare area behind the house? So I would need to know what kind of sunlight conditions you have, but the ones I've mentioned today, like golden groundsel, maybe some sedges, those are really great plants to add there. And you could use that in a matrix planting too. So, right, picking one species and adding it to the entire landscape and then interplanting with other species throughout. If you have full sun, like hot full sun, you could do purple poppy mallow. I really love that plant. It's a ground cover creeper and it climbs up through grasses and other plants nicely. Okay, y'all. So I know I've kept you a little past time, but I just want to thank you for joining us this year for our Deep Roots Native Plant webinars. I'm your host, Cydney Ross, and it has been my absolute pleasure to share my love and passion of native plants with you all. And I look forward to seeing you all in 2025. Our next webinar program will be on Thursday, January 2nd. It'll be our recorded episode of our sand prairies with Missouri Department of Conservation. It was a really cool episode that aired a couple years ago, and I thought we would go ahead and bring it back as we start off in the new year. So please take care. Be sure to look for the email, which will include resources and our end of season survey, and have a safe and happy holiday and new year. Thank you so much.